Welcome back, team. We're going to finish up chapter 8. We're going to talk about leadership and the 5 stages of team development. As I read through this portion of the text, I think it makes sense from an academic perspective. A lot of the 5 stages, and I've been involved over the years in a lot of team development, and I'm not sure the 5 stages actually make a lot of sense. Maybe it's the way they've been, pointed out in the book, but I think at the end of the day, you can take the 5 stages and then alter them or change them in such a way that it works for you, especially from an operational perspective. So there's some nuggets embedded in there. It's just I'm not sure that I guess I would have laid them out quite like the authors did in the text. But be that as it may, the stages of it, of development, and there's some notations in the front, part of this little segment of the text, and it says, move team as expeditiously as possible to the 4th stage of performing, fully functional and performing, hopefully efficiently. And I can agree with that. You want to get to that stage where the team is up and running. And if it is a long-term team, you may have a little more latitude, may have a little more time to work through some of these stages, and you can name the stages whatever you want to, but kind of work through some of the stages and get the teams to where they're fully functional. But if this is a special project, I see it all the time as a consultant. I'm on, 30, 60, 90-day contract, in and out, get the teams up and running, get them functional. You don't have a lot of time. So just I guess go back to one of the earlier where they talk about effective leadership, and they talk about leaders, followers, context. And again, context, situation, whatever terminology you want to use, I think that drives the decisions the majority of the time for any given leader. And the second piece of it, it talks about possible for team to revert back to an earlier stage. And that is true, because you get a new team member, you end up getting maybe even a new leader. And so now you have personality issues, how do they fit in? Saw it a lot at Health Net when we were working on government contracts, and they were taking and they would shuffle team leads especially, and actually some of the individuals within those teams, depending on what transpired in these government contracts. So what would typically happen, the government would send out an RFP for a contract. Individuals, units, or individuals, entities that were interested in bidding on the contracts had the opportunity to ask questions. The government come back with clarifying answers to questions. And what happened, in the numerous instances, would be that the government would change the parameters of the contract based on the questions asked by those individuals that were interested in bidding on the contracts. And as those contract parameters changed, you would see, at least within Health Net, you would see some shuffling going around. Maybe the leads would switch teams. Maybe individual members would switch from one team to the next based on expertise and the requirements that the government was changing and now making part of the bid process. And then lastly, they talk about issues with leadership at various stages of development. And again, it goes back to, and I think to me, the issues with the leadership is not so much the leadership style as it could be the expertise and maybe the experience or the capabilities that the leader brings to a specific team, or especially to a specific project on a team. And then the text with the authors, they jump into their 5 stages. And, the stage number 1 is the forming stage. And that's when the leader develops, ground rules, puts out the vision, determines the goals, tries to lay out, not only where where the team needs to go from point A to point B, but what the timeline is, and tries to provide the parameters for all of the team members that are going to determine how the team functions and responds throughout whatever that timeline is. And then they have the second stage, and it's called storming. And it's, you're trying to encourage equal participation, trying to maintain fairness, identify differences and conflicts, revise team membership if you need to. And again, this is a stage where it depends on the context, especially if it's a long run team or a team that's going to be formed to manage a long run process. You need to spend some time trying to get everything ironed out. If it's a really short run project and you've got like a 30-day time frame to get from point A to point B and get the goals met and get, let's say it's an RFP for a government grant, and you've got to get the information out the door. You don't have a lot of time in this storming, I guess, stage to get all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and you're almost to some extent flying by the seat of your pants and having to adjust on the run or on the fly. And then the norming stage, that's stage number 3. It talks about clarifying, evolving stage, roles, norms, values. To me, that should have been taken care of, in the first 2 stages, but the authors have got it as a distinct stage. And then you've got stage number 4, performing. You built the identity of the team. You're monitoring the environment. You're facilitating change, and you may be outlining new vision. And to me, that's not necessarily a stage, as it is it's just the process embedded in the entire process from start to finish. You're constantly monitoring, or at least I would hope you're constantly monitoring as a leader, monitoring the stages, monitoring the team members, monitoring the process as you go along. I'm not sure it needs an official stage. And then throw one in kind of at the end, there's an adjournment. So 30-day cycle, 60-day, 90-day cycle. You've done the work, you've put the government grant to bed, you put the RFP to the contract to bed. It's a new operational process that you developed and you put to bed. And I think one of the most important parts of it is to try to get together one last time with the team and outline any lessons learned. Document the lessons learned. If you had additional resources, this would be a different, outcome. If you'd had more time, maybe not, maybe you have a process you want to change. So I think at this point, and this is a step that a lot of teams seem to forget about, but lessons learned are extremely important, not only for the team members on this team, but information they can take back if they're ever brought into another, especially short run team situation. It's information that they can throw out maybe in that first stage. So, here's what we learned in the last process, and maybe we can change the process going forward. And then they go through, so they've got the 5 stages. Then they go through with, when leadership is lacking, what happens in the 5 stages? And again, the forming stage, and it makes a lot of sense. If leadership's lacking, there's confusion, there's, lack of common norms, there's a lack of, vision and direction, and it gets the team off to I don't want to say gets them in a step in the wrong direction, but definitely puts them at a disadvantage in actually completing the goals or completing the requirements of the request. And then you've got storming, and it ends up in, disinterest, negative attributions, destructive conflict. It's not a good situation to be in the storming. And then when you get to the norming process, you end up, and that's where kind of the group think and maybe the free rider comes in. You've got a lack of teamwork. and you actually drift back to the storming stage because you're still trying to figure out what's going on. And then when you get to the performing stage, if the leadership's lacking, the goals and the mission becomes outdated. The leader hasn't been monitoring along the process like they should have, and so you've got a process and goals and a vision that's outdated, and it's constantly. I mean, to me, to eliminate this, you ought to be constantly reevaluating and monitoring, and back in the forming and storming stages, or maybe even up to the norming stages, you should be evaluating and backing this process up and getting everybody on the same page so that you can be extremely efficient when you get down toward the end of the project. And then at that point, they get into shared leadership. And shared leadership can get confusing at times. It can get frustrating. It can get inefficient. It can get non-productive. And shared leadership, they describe it as mutual influence, shared responsibility among team members, whereby they lead each other toward the team's goals. And that is great if you have a team with some individuals that are extremely capable, extremely knowledgeable, that are trying to hone their leadership skills, and in a shared leadership responsibility, you can actually get to that delegation stage and turn it loose to them. But you have to be really careful as a leader as to at what stage you turn that responsibility over to your individuals. And again, it goes back to the early chapters where they're talking about leadership is all about control and how that control is managed. The leader's ultimate goal is to develop team members to share response, in leadership role. And that should be the role of a leader. From my perspective, should be the role of a leader, no matter what kind of a team you're trying to build, whether it's a long-run team or a short-run team. You're trying, again, goes back to building human capital. You're trying to build the human capital to help develop those individuals that want to work their way up the corporate ladder. And by building that human capital and the capabilities of those future leaders, it's going to be extremely beneficial for the company, both in the short run, but also in the long run. Team functions, goals, processes, policies, procedures, personal and emotional needs. One person, especially if it's a large team, and that goes back to what we talked about earlier and probably the previous segment, I guess it was, when you were talking about as teams get large, you end up with kind of these diseconomies of scale as teams get large. And typically, diseconomies of scales are talking about output on a team. And to some extent, that's what you're talking about here. You're talking about the output and the final product that this team puts together. And at some point, if you've got such a large team, one person can't manage it all. And then the authors talk about motivating unresponsive team members. Talk about, especially important for semi-autonomous teams and projects. And it is important if you're trying to move to a situation where you're trying to delegate control to new individuals, and you're turning your team, it's kind of a quote shared responsibility, shared between maybe yourself and individuals that you have picked out to lead this team. And so you're talking about either a semi-autonomous or an autonomous situation. And you as the leader, you have to be responsible, and you have to be ready to move and to move control in that direction. And hopefully you've trained everybody and you have everybody up to speed. And again, I keep pounding and keep harping on, you're trying to develop a team's human capital and leadership capability to drive goals, profits, and motivation for all the team members. Again, human capital is the lifeblood of any organization. If you go back to the factors of production that you talked about in in your economics classes, or especially when talking about theory of the firm, what are those factors of production? You've got labor, you've got capital stock, you've got what the economists call natural resources, and usually you're talking about land when you're talking about natural resources. You're talking about technology, and technology is more about the technology of the production process as opposed to computer chips. And then you've got entrepreneurship that helps develop the technology and then efficiency on the theory of the firm. And so if you go back to that first factor of production and you're talking about labor, there's only two ways to improve the efficiency by the use of labor. And that is, one, hire more warm bodies. Some of those warm bodies may be unskilled, but you can hire warm bodies and throw more bodies at it. Or two, you can improve the training and the education and the efficiency that the warm bodies bring to the table. And that's where it goes back to the human capital aspect. Mentoring, motivating, training, coaching, especially especially a team that's developed for the long haul, you're going to significantly increase the efficiency and the productivity of those teams. And then lastly, the authors bring up an issue that a lot of leaders, I guess, have been struggling with over the last couple of years, especially since late 2020, early 21, when COVID really blew up. I guess in Q1 of 2021 is when it really started impacting companies. There's a lot of companies shut down, sent employees home. Everybody was working remotely. Everybody was working, well, I'm going to work from home. I'm going to, and most companies found that that productivity might not have been as efficient, might not have been at the level that the company leaders expected by sending these individuals home. And what you're talking about, a virtual team, it's a team that is geographically distributed, oftentimes relatively temporary in nature, and largely dependent on virtual media for communication purposes. And that's a virtual team. When I worked at United, we had a virtual team. I was in San Diego. The chief medical director was in Laguna Niguel, and again, close to LA. We had a strategy person in Connecticut. We had an individual in Florida, and we had another of the senior team located in Minneapolis. So the senior management team scattered all over the United States. And it was a virtual team. And, we were constantly on the phone with each other, constantly doing, it was before it was, pre-Zoom, but there was some opportunities to do video conferencing. And so that's the way we were working. My first job out of graduate school, I even did virtual education when I was at Ohio State in graduate school. When I first got out of graduate school, I went to work for the Economic Research Service. It's the analytical, the economists that work for the Department of Agriculture, stationed in DC, but we had individuals at regional offices in each state in the United States. So we had a virtual team. Health plans have virtual teams. United, Aetna, Cigna, all of the, maybe Centene, all of the national players have virtual teams. That's the way the way of the business in healthcare if you're a national health plan. COVID drove a lot of businesses into virtual teams, even local businesses. They sent people home. You had to learn to communicate with Teams and with telephone and with chat and with Zoom. And it just got to the point that because there was, with COVID, especially early on in 2021, there was not a lot of face-to-face communication. And so remote work and, the labor factors have taken over. You've got a lot of companies that are, globally oriented businesses. So managing a virtual team is going to be probably first and foremost once you get out and get into the business world. I wouldn't be surprised if most of you end up at some level on a virtual team with maybe even at least a national, but maybe even a globally oriented business. Now, the virtual teams typically, and at least according to the text, typically can be temporary. I'm not sure I agree with that either, because I go back to the national health plans or go back to ERS. Those aren't, those aren't temporary teams, but I see where the textbook is headed, and I see where the authors are heading, because a lot of issues, especially bidding on contracts and grants and RFPs and RFIs and requests for proposals, requests for information. You have a lot of virtual teams that are temporary in nature, formed to attack a particular grant, a particular proposal, a particular project. Think about all your major consulting firms. PricewaterhouseCoopers, they've got virtual teams scattered all over the United States. The same with all your big accounting firms. So that's the virtual aspect of leadership it's going to continue. It's going to grow over time. I think most people see it happening. And again, it's based on local, it's based on skills, it's motivation, goals. Leaders might not need the expertise, but the needs of leadership and process skills. So they may bring leaders together that may not have the expertise or down in the weeds expertise, but they have the leadership capability and understand how to manage the processes. And again, go back to your microeconomics. A lot of firms are concerned with the marginal product of labor, and you as a leader have to be able to maximize that marginal product of labor. It's less, they talk about these I guess temporary teams as being less transformational leadership occurs. It's kind of like, and you really have a problem with these temporary teams, especially if they're geographically located. And we touched on it earlier. We touched on the free rider, the social loafing, that kind of out of sight, out of mind, I guess, attitude that a lot of these individuals on these virtual teams may end up having, because who's watching them? I mean, yeah, there are computer programs that can check and see what they're doing on their laptop on a daily basis, but they've also got a personal laptop. They can sit there and be working. They can be watching television. They can, it is difficult to manage these individuals on a virtual team. And unless your team has the work ethic and the drive and the desire to be successful that you do, it can get difficult with these free riders and the social loafing. And these temporary teams and the virtual teams are subject to matrix structure. Permanent team goals may override the virtual team goals. So again, matrix structure. United had a great matrix structure. We all had small teams, but you were securing goods and services and expertise from other teams across the company, and you did run into issues where the goals of the virtual teams, the standing room or the standing teams, I guess you could refer to them, sometimes those goals overrode the virtual team goals. And, the virtual media for communication, you end up with poor communication and group process difficulties. I don't know how many people have been on a Zoom meeting with teams, and you see people, you can tell they're playing on their cell phone. You can tell they're looking around. Sometimes I've had virtual classrooms with students that would, just, turn their screen, they turn their computer off. You still knew they were there, but they turned the video off. You didn't know what they were doing. And it gets really difficult. I mean, in academia, you run into the same issues with these, with virtual, teaching class with Zoom or teaching class with Teams. It gets really difficult because It's hard to keep everybody's attention. And then lastly, right before they kind of tie everything together, they talk about how to address challenges. Meet face-to-face early on. And I agree with that. If there's anything at all possible, get everybody together early on in the project, especially on these temporary teams, and lay out the ground rules. Make sure everybody understands who the players are and what the expectations are. Encourage frequent video conferencing. Typically, when I'm, especially as a consultant, first thing I do every morning at 8 o'clock is I pull a team meeting together and lay out what the expectations are of the day and what I expect everybody to do. And that's where you answer questions. And that's where if there's changes in the vision or changes in the process, that's where you get it out there so everybody knows what's going on. Develop the ground rules for sensitive and complex communications. I mean, especially on these government contracts, you have to be really careful about sensitive communications and how information is flowing between not only the team members, but, between the team members and individuals that you're trying to grab information and bring it in and trying to put the project together. And then lastly, they talk about shared leadership is important, and it is important. You've got to feel comfortable with, as a leader, you have to feel comfortable with the team and vice versa. Remember, text talks constantly about it takes two to tango. So the leader has to feel comfortable with the followers, and the followers have to definitely feel comfortable with the leader to ensure that any type of shared leadership is sufficient and works properly. And I think that's going to wind us up with Chapter 8. When we come back the next time we get together, we're going to start talking about Chapter 9. Talk to everybody soon. Thanks for joining.